The problem of the South African apartheid began when the Dutch settlers arrived in 1651. By 1756, Dutch settlers were importing slaves from West Africa, India, and Malaysia, beginning the dominance of whites over non-whites in the region. In 1810, missionaries from Britain came over and criticized the racism of the Dutch farmers. The farmers justified their racism with the belief that they were superior to the Africans and that God gave them the land and they shouldn't give it up. The South African Act was put into place in 1910, taking away all political rights of Africans. By 1913, the Native Lands Act gave 7.3% of the country's land to Africans, who made up 80% of the population. Africans were no longer allowed to own land or be on white land. In the 1920s, blacks were fired from jobs that were then given to whites. Less than 30% of Africans were getting any education, and whites were earning 5 times more money. The Representation of Voters Act was put into place in 1936, weakening political rights for Africans in certain regions and allowing them to only vote for whites. By 1951, the Group Areas Act had set aside specific communities for each of the races. These communities were unsanitary, had no health care, decent education, or space. Africans were required to carry identification booklets and were often stopped and harassed for their passes. Also, Nelson Mandela was jailed. He was head of the African National Congress, an organization made to liberate colored people.
You don't have to have education in order to know that you want certain fundamental rights. There is room for all the various races in this country.
During the South African apartheid, the teacher-to-pupil ratio was 1 to 60 for colored people and 1 to 22 for white people. The doctors-to-population ratio for the colored population was 1 to 44,000, but for the white population it was 1 to 400. The share of national income for colored people was less than 20%, while white people had a share of over 75%.
Many countries reacted differently to apartheid and its laws, but they were all striving for the same goal: to end apartheid. For example, a British organization named the Anti-Apartheid Movement campaigned for an end to apartheid. It centered on the opposition of the system of apartheid in South Africa. The movement led a national boycott of South African imports and led campaigns. In response to the arrests of 156 activists in South Africa, the AAM set up the Treason Trial Defence Fund that appealed to activists in the UK. The anti-apartheid movement held a 72-hour guarding period outside the Commonwealth Conference venue to protest against the apartheid laws in South Africa. The United Nations General Assembly voted to make strict diplomatic, economic, and transportation relations with South Africa after South African police shot 72 men, women, and children protesters that were boycotting against the Natives Act of 1952. The Natives Act of 1952 required black people to carry identification with them at all times. In 1964, South Africa was banned from the Winter Olympics in Japan. The International Olympic Committee declared that South Africa may only participate in the Olympics if they abolish racial discrimination in sports and end apartheid. The IOC gave South Africa 50 days to declare the ban of apartheid. South Africa did not agree to this, and they were banned from the Olympics until 1992. The anti-apartheid movement helped initiate the academic boycott of South Africa in 1965. The declaration was signed by lecturers and university professors from 34 British universities to protest against apartheid and violations of freedom of African Americans. Part of the declaration included protests against the practice of racial discrimination and that they would not accept academic posts from universities in South Africa. The African Groups of Sweden helped the victims of apartheid in South Africa. It was created in 1974. They boycotted outside supermarkets and had demonstrations to attract people. The African Groups of Sweden also worked in places affected by apartheid. The apartheid laws in South Africa could have been abolished earlier if the West and the US were more active in the response against apartheid. During Ronald Reagan's term in office as president, he still maintained a close alliance with the South African government, and the Reagan administration found the African National Congress as being dangerous and pro-communist. The US also avoided the criticism that was against the racial policies in South Africa. At first, Britain and the UN refused to accept that apartheid in South Africa fell under Chapter 12 of the United Nations Charter. It allowed the UN Security Council to determine if any threats existed to the international peace and security, and that they may take military or non-military actions to restore the peace. Britain had key trade links in South Africa and, more importantly, needed its gold. The relationships of Britain and South Africa began to change in 1960 to 1961. Harold Macmillan was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and he urged South Africa to become racially equal. In Macmillan's Wind of Change speech in Cape Town, in South Africa, he spoke of the changes in Africa and how their apartheid laws and regulations were getting stricter and more harsh. Persistently, Britain and the US voted against sanctions in South Africa.
The result of the global response slowly took shape after many years of protesting apartheid. The AAM scored a victory over South Africa when they were forced to leave the Commonwealth, an intergovernmental organization that shared common goals and values which promoted democracy, human rights, and world peace. The ejection of South Africa from the Commonwealth resulted in a trade boycott against the country as long as they were practicing apartheid. In 1963, the UN called upon all nations involved to cease the sale and shipment of arms, ammunition, and military vehicles to South Africa. This made acquiring guns and weapons used during protests harder. In addition to the arms embargo instituted by the UN, they also tried to halt the supply of petroleum to South Africa. Also, all states were requested to stop cultural, educational, and sporting events between them and racist organizations in South Africa that practice apartheid. The UN was trying to isolate the country so that they would be forced to end apartheid if they wanted to be accepted. Other countries took part in the effort to end apartheid. Most started campaigns to help out victims. Sweden established the Africa Groups of Sweden, AGS, an organization supporting liberation struggles. The Africa Groups Recruitment Organization, ARO, was also initiated by the AGS. It recruited healthcare workers, teachers, and administrators to work in places affected by apartheid. Later on, they expanded to work in ANC camps and schools. Bread and Fishes, a Christian organization, also lent their hand in assisting victims. They started off raising money and then shipped goods and medical supplies to ANC camps in addition to giving direct financial support. All these organizations worked to alleviate the hardships associated with apartheid. To this day, there are companies such as Anglo American and General Motors who are offering reparations to victims.